Hello, I'm excited to present today joint work with Kate Call and Brian Bonner, looking at how people learn vicariously from the failures of people with whom they share a group. Now imagine you're a contestant on the show Survivor, and you're engaged in a team challenge. In this challenge, everyone on the team gets an opportunity to complete the same task, like launching water balloons at a target. Now, you're not the first person on your team to engage the task, somebody else is. You're actually towards the back. Who do you watch to get an idea of the best way that you might successfully complete the task? Do you watch your team members or do you watch people on other teams? And then do you learn more by watching what your teammates do that is successful or what your teammates do that results in failure? These are the questions that we're asking. Our research question is, how does a group context impact vicarious learning? And we have three hypotheses that we test over three studies. The first hypothesis is we predict individuals will learn more from observing the experience of a group member than individuals who observe the experience of a non-group member. Second, we predict that the type of outcome that people observe impacts their learning done, such that people learn more by observing a failure of a group member than from observing a success. And finally, we predict an interaction between these two, group context and the type of observed outcome, such that people will learn the most when they observe the failure of a group member. Now, in our first study, we had participants estimate the driving distance between Paris, France, and Vienna, Austria. Participants were randomly assigned to a group context or a non-group context condition. In both conditions, participants first submitted an estimate of the driving time between the two cities, and then were given the opportunity to pick a piece of information that would help them in their second estimate. We then gave participants information about either a group member or a stranger regarding their second estimate, how accurate it was, and the piece of information this person had chosen to help them improve their estimate. Then participants in both conditions submitted their second estimates and finished the study. Our dependent variable is whether participants changed the piece of information they chose based on what they had learned or based on what they observed or learned about their teammate or a stranger. And what we find is participants who learned about the experience of a team member on this task were 11% more likely to change their piece of information that they had selected than those who learned about the experience of a non-group member. We take this as evidence that people, or as initial evidence that people are learning more from when they're observing the experience of a teammate than from somebody who's not a teammate or does not share the same group context. In our second study, we then test if the type of outcome that is observed impacts learning. And we predict that people are going to learn more from failures than from observing failures than from observing successes. In this study, participants read a scenario and were asked how likely they would be to engage in a specific type of behavior. Then participants were given either a piece of information about a teammate that was either the teammate had succeeded or failed, and then were asked to update or to how likely they would be to engage in the action. And this is our deviated that change, the magnitude of change between their estimated likelihood of taking an action. Now what we find is participants report being significantly more likely to participants report that a greater change in the likelihood of taking an action when they observe the experience, a failure experience of a teammate rather than a successful experience of a teammate. And finally, in our third study, we test for that interaction, the interaction between group context and type of experience that is observed. We do this in a scenario study. We follow the same study design as study 2. However, in this study, we also manipulate group context. So whether each participant reads a scenario, one of them had to do with climate change, an advertising campaign to to increase awareness about climate change. And after reading the initial scenario, participants again submitted an estimate of the likelihood of taking an action. Then participants were randomly assigned to receive information about a teammate or someone outside of their group context about a failed experience or a successful experience, and then update or report again how likely they'd be to take an action. And what we find is participants, we replicate the findings from the first two studies. First, participants are more likely to report being the change their estimate. The magnitude of their change was greater when the information came from a teammate than from a non-teammate, and was greater when the information came from a failure than from a success. And then testing the interaction, we find that when participants observe a failure of a teammate, they change their likelihood of taking action significantly more than any of the other options. And we take this as evidence that participants or people are learning the most from observing the failures of their own teammates. Thank you, and I'm excited to hear your feedback.